I'd like to ask you about another aspect of this whole issue in terms of, you mentioned mandatory sentencing laws, especially in relationship to the war on drugs. One of the aspects that rarely gets much attention, you might want to talk about it, is how mandatory sentencing laws have essentially corrupted the criminal justice system by pressuring many defendants to basically cop a plea rather than take their chances through an actual trial where their guilt or innocence might be decided by a jury.
That's right. We will never know how many innocent people are doing time for supposed drug offenses in the United States. But there's good reason to believe that those numbers are higher than they've ever been because of mandatory sentencing laws. Today, for a relatively minor drug crime, you could be looking at 5, 10, even a life sentence in prison. Now, if you are arrested and charged with, a relatively minor drug offense and told that you will spend 25 years in prison if you take your case to trial, but if you cop a plea and get only 3 years, or a few months, or even be willing to be labeled a felon for life, you'll be out in a matter of months, days, or just a few years. Most people aren't willing to take the risk that they could be forfeiting decades of their life for a minor drug offense, and will take the deal, whether innocent or guilty.
And then explain, Michelle Alexander,
what guilty is overwhelming.
Explain then what that means once a person is a felon in terms of the rights they lose for life.
Yes, well, once you're branded a felon, you may be denied the right to vote, automatically excluded from juries, and legally discriminated against in employment, housing, access to education, and public benefits. The very rights that we supposedly won for African Americans in the civil rights movement no longer exist for those labeled felons. That's why I say we have not ended racial caste in America. We've merely redesigned it. All the old forms of discrimination, the forms of discrimination we supposedly left behind, are now perfectly legal once you've been labeled a felon. And thanks to the war on drugs, millions of people of color have been branded felons for relatively minor drug activity. In the past few decades.
Michelle Alexander,
our prison population has quintupled.
To what in terms of the world, comparing our prison population to the rest of the world?
Yes, well, our prison population has quintupled. We've gone from about 300,000 people behind bars in the 1970s, a time, by the way, that many civil rights activists thought that our rates of incarceration were egregiously high. But we went from about 300,000 people in prison and jails to more than 2 million today. And the vast majority of that increase has been due to drug offenses. About 2/3 of the increase in the federal prison population is due to drug offenses, and more than half of the increase in the state population.
Can you talk, Michelle Alexander, for 1 sec? I just wanted to ask if you could talk about the jailing of black men, often in white rural communities, and what that means in terms of bringing federal aid into those communities.
Yes, kind of a well-kept secret about the way our census laws and redistricting operates in the United States is that people who are warehoused in prisons, and the majority of new prison building in the United States has taken place in relatively white rural areas. The majority of the people who are put in those prisons, particularly in a state like New York, are poor people of color. But the people warehoused in those prisons are denied the right to vote, right? But those people behind bars are counted through the census as part of the local population for the purposes of redistricting, leading to a greater number of state representatives assigned to those rural communities, even though the people behind bars can't vote, and they're not accountable to them. And additional federal funding flows to those communities because their population has been inflated because they have such large prison populations. Meanwhile, the poor communities of color, from which these prisoners came, lose representation in their state legislatures because their population has declined, and the funding and support that might otherwise flow to those communities is reduced because their numbers have been deflated as a result of the mass imprisonment of their community members in rural white communities.
Michelle Alexander, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Her new book is called The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Thank you so much.